Today, we had the pleasure of meeting Niro Feliciano, a psychotherapist, author, and national media commentator. We first saw Niro on the documentary series Secrets of Hillsong, where she gave her perspective on spiritual community. We had the intention of just speaking about the Hillsong controversy, but the conversation naturally evolved into so much more.
We discuss her relationship with faith, helping others heal from spiritual abuse, and how God can speak to us through people in our lives. She also shares how science and spirituality connect, the importance of keeping an open mind with new concepts, and how to use discernment when entering spiritual communities. We felt like this was an important conversation to have, and we hope you enjoy this episode. All right, well, Niro, thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm happy to be here.
So, for any listeners out there that aren't familiar with your work, what do you do?
So, I'm a psychotherapist. I've treated anxiety pretty much in private practice for the last, we're almost at 18 years. But now have moved into more writing. I had a book come out in 20, and I do a lot of speaking as well in corporate wellness. But anxiety has been my main area for the last few decades now.
How did you get into this work? What was like the catalyst to, have you start working in this field?
Yeah, so it's funny. If you talk to any therapist, they'll tell you they've been doing this work long before they actually got trained in it. We were the people that everybody came to talk to their problems in like the sixth grade. So it's always been in me. I do think when you're working in different helping fields, it's more of a calling, and you begin to discover that as it evolves, even really young, I think, in childhood. But for me, I actually went to medical school first. My desire was to become a surgeon and work in women's health. And what I realized in that path was that what I liked was talking to people, and women go through so many different transitions physically and emotionally. And that was more what attracted me to it. So I had an event in my life where I was trying to make a decision because I just gotten married. My husband's a surgeon, and that was never part of my plan to marry a surgeon. That was supposed to be me. So, and we were talking about what it's going to look like for our life and our family. And I said, let me take a year off and think about it, which most medical students don't do. But I was 27 and a little bit older at the time. And so I didn't drive my husband crazy at home. I was like, I'm going to start a master's just because I am so bored just being at home, not doing anything. And I started a master's in clinical social work, mainly in counseling, and thought, you know what, I could see this as being a part of my life. I had no idea where it would lead to, but it felt like the right thing. And certainly there was a lot of spiritual confirmation that this was where I needed to be. That was
Can
the
you talk
beginning.
a little bit about that spiritual confirmation? I'm very
Yeah.
curious about
Yeah. So I think for me, and I do think, the higher power I call God, speaks in different ways to different people. And for me, there are signs everywhere when God is trying to communicate. It can be a change of event in circumstance that makes you think, oh, okay, why is this happening right now? What am I supposed to get from this? What am I supposed to learn from this? It literally can be a person that says something to you that you hear more of the divine in their words than that person. And that's actually what happened to me. There were many different things that alerted my attention during my first year of medical school to make me think, is this the right thing? There was an uneasiness in me thinking, how are we going to reconcile our relationship? Being that my husband and I were at two different points. He had just started residency and I'd started medical school. And I thought, I'm going to be in this marriage where I'm not going to see this person for the next 12 years. And some people are okay with that. But for me, I was like, I'm not okay with that. That's to me not what marriage is about. And especially in two really high stress careers. So there were a lot of things that happened, but um, I'll tell you what happened. I took the year off from school. And also I'm always praying, like, God, speak to me, show me something, tell me something. I often read things in scripture that speak directly to my circumstance. I'll be reading a devotional for the day, and all of a sudden I'll be like, oh my gosh, like that was written for me for today. That was a word for me. But I took the year off of medical school the year I started my master's. And I could have signed myself out of school anytime that year, but I could not make the decision. I did not have that spiritual confirmation, even though I knew. And sometimes spiritual confirmation doesn't mean that we're feeling peaceful. It's just a knowing. Just because you know doesn't mean there's peace. Sometimes that comes after. And my husband and I had had so many conversations that year about why it was the right decision for me to leave medicine and pursue this other career. And the night before, I basically had the whole year. The day before I actually had to go back to my med school and sign out, we had had a conversation where I listed all of these reasons. There were 7 reasons why I felt like it was the right choice. So we go to church that day, that morning, the next morning. And like I'm usually late to church a little bit. I call it CPT, colored people time. And forgive me if there are colored people that are on time. It's not me. And so we like walk into church. We sit in a totally different section, and I go to a big church, and I sit behind this person that I don't know who she is. So at the end of church, she stands up and she's like, "Niro," and she opens her arms to give me a hug. I'm like, I'm gonna go in for a hug. I don't know who you are, but she knew me. I said, "How are you?" And she said, "I'm good. How are you?" And she goes, "Aren't you in medical school?" And now I'd been out for the year. And also, a lot of people in my church didn't know me in terms of going to medical school. They knew me as a speaker in the church. I used to sing. I used to sing in the church. But they didn't know I went to medical school. And she goes, "I was just talking about you with someone. And I was thinking, how does Niro handle this with all these other giftings that she had? Can I tell you, this woman who didn't know me listed the 7 reasons that I was talking with my husband about over the year, and especially the night before." And I just started crying, and I said, "Woman who," like I didn't tell her I didn't know her, but I can't even tell you how God just spoke to you through me, to me, because my husband and I just had this conversation last night, and tomorrow I'm supposed to go to school and sign myself out. And you just confirmed everything that we said. So it can come in crazy ways like that too. But I think if we're looking for it and we're asking for it, we will see it in a way that is significant to us. I always think God speaks our language, whatever language that is to hear, if we're asking or looking.
Yeah, the synchronicities of life are incredible once you start looking for them. And yeah, you can ask, God, the universe, source energy, whatever you
Mm,
want to call it, to open yourself up to receiving those messages. And once you start
mm,
getting them, or, I'd be curious what your connection is with your intuition as well. If you feel
yeah,
connected to this inner part of you, this inner wisdom that kind of guides you, where you
I
need to be
do.
next.
Yeah, I will hear in my spirit, it's an impression. And obviously, well, some people, I guess very few actually hear an audible voice. Some people do. I don't. But there will be some thoughts that are very, very clear that will make me say, "Oh." And sometimes I know they're not from myself. The first time I had the thought that I should maybe pursue another career, I was like, "Oh no, I've worked too hard to get here." But so I know that they're not really from me. And then that will be confirmed in some way, shape, or form, with one of those signs or synchronicity or scripture. In my case, is where I hear a lot. So yes, tapping into that intuition is important. I have heard things for other people. I'll give you an example. I'll be praying. I was praying for a friend once, a friend, longtime friend. She's a writer. She's an author. She usually only writes for spiritual publications and Christian publications. Oh, she's written for the New York Times. And I was praying for her, and I heard in my, like a random word, I heard time, as in Time magazine. And I was talking to her like 2 weeks later, and she said to me, "Did I tell you like I got a spot in Time magazine?" And I was like, "No, but I knew it." And I had, when I get these things, I write them in a notes section in my phone. And I texted her the note. She goes, "That's crazy." I said, "You've never written for Time, right?" And she said, "No." I said, "But I heard it, and then I started praying for that opportunity for you." And she said, "Oh my gosh, that's amazing." Because it really was kind of far out of left field for her. One, it's a huge publication, and two, it was not one she typically would write for or has written for. But I felt it clear as day, and I wrote it in the notes section of my phone. So we can have it for other people too, but I have gotten it for myself. My daughter has had it, my 12-year-old has had it since she was very young, even before she could really spell words correctly. she would know something. And she calls it a knowing. And when she was so young, I'd ask her, "How do you know, Sophia?" And Sophia means wisdom in Greek. So she was
Mm.
named pretty aptly. Um, and she would say to me, "Mama, I just knowed." And one of the things she said to me, it's just so cute. Um, I started doing the Today Show around the time my book came out. And, you go on the Today Show or Good Morning America, whatever, like once. You go on for your book. It's a big deal. And that's it. And before I went on, it was like a couple days before, she goes, "Mommy, you know how you do some of these news things?" Because I would do local news, mental health, parenting, that kind of thing. And they kept asking me back. And at first it was a big deal, but then it was like no big deal. And you kept going back. I was like, "Yeah, yeah." She goes, "That's going to happen with the Today Show." And I said, "Oh, you're so cute." No, it doesn't happen like that. I'm going back next week for my 11th segment in a little over a year. So that was her knowing. And I think God speaks through kids all the time. People who are pure in heart, who are unencumbered, unhindered to hear and experience spirituality, I think God speaks to the loudest, and they don't question it. They
Yeah.
don't question it.
Yeah.
That veil is like a lot thinner for them.
Thinner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They can
It
reach the
is.
divine so much easier, and they don't question it, like you
Yes.
said. They're like,
Yeah.
"Oh, but that's just how kids are." They feel something or they say something and they let it out in all ways.
Yeah. For us, we'd be overthinking. We'd be
Yeah.
like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And we'd
Yes.
be like,
Or like, who am I to say
Question
that?
it.
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the
So
Bible, it talks about having faith like a child, and
Mm.
that's what they're talking about. It's just believing. And I remember at one point, um, I was reading a book on angels. I'm always so curious about angels. And one thing that it said in the book was that kids see angels all the time. And I went to this, I have four. But this is the one that is most intuitive. And I said to her, "Sophia, have you ever seen an angel?" And she was like, "Oh, yeah." And I was like,
oh,
"What? You didn't tell me about this? When did this happen?" She was like, "Oh, this a while ago." I said, "What?" She said, "I woke up in the middle of the night and there was this really tall, flowy, like silvery dressed woman." I said, "Weren't you terrified?" She goes, "No, I just woke up." I was like, "Wow." And I said, "And then when?" She goes, "Then I went back to sleep." But she
Oh,
never spoke
God.
about it, never told me about it until I asked.
how old is
It
she?
was no big deal. Now she's 12. That probably happened when I probably asked her when she was around 9 when I was reading that book. And it had happened. She never talked about it.
How special. Does she want to come on the podcast? I'm kidding.
She should sometime. She
Oh,
That's
should
so cute.
sometime. But talk about confirmation. So when I was writing my book and before that, and this is why I said she could barely spell, and I've actually kept a little book of these note cards. She would have a thought, write it on an index card, and leave it for me somewhere around the house. And I would pick up this card, and it would speak exactly to what I was feeling and
Mm.
going through in my life. So, and this is coming from my child, who probably was anywhere from 7 to 9 years old at the time. And she had no idea. It was just a thought that she had that she didn't question, that she felt like she had to write down on a card. But it was a message for me. I mean, I thought, how special that, the divine cares so much to pursue
Yeah.
us in different ways when we're open to it. And going back to the thought of that intuition, you have to have some silence and clarity. And the times where I'm not in touch with my intuition is when I'm busy, when I don't make time to sit and be still and listen, connect with myself and connect with God. It's so easy to tune it out, you know.
Yeah.
So I do think that that's really important for um, that connection to happen.
Yeah. And again, taking a note out of your daughter's book of just letting it come out and not taking a moment to really think about it, or should I be saying this? Should I be doing this? Just kind of letting
Right.
it flow through you. I'm
Yeah.
curious
Yeah.
because as we're talking, it seems like you have these two parts of yourself. You have, you know, this more traditional career. You're very well educated. And then you have this part of you that's really open to almost like the mysteries of life. Do
hmm
you ever feel like those things how are you able to honor those two parts of yourself?
Yeah. I don't feel like they ever are opposing.
Mm,
And it's interesting because especially in my faith, what I've learned is God is so detailed and specific, and so is science, you know. And I feel like there are too many things, especially the more you learn about the human body. I'm grateful for the time I did spend in medical school because you learn how specific that design is. And to think that there was not a designer behind it, that this just happened as an accident, to me blows my mind. My whole family are scientists. My parents are both physicians. My husband is a surgeon, and we're all people of faith, because we understand the specificity in science. I've also done a lot of work. I wrote a chapter in my book on faith and neurotheology. And there's so many things in terms of our brain and how we were designed that wire us for spirituality and for contentment, which is so interesting. And also, when we engage in those practices, we find that we physically are healthier, we live longer, we have stronger immune systems. All of that to me does not go against this idea of spirituality and the fact that there's a higher power. So it's not something I've really had to reconcile. The thing that is hard to reconcile are scientists who don't believe in it, because
Yeah.
you can ask them, well, what does this mean? The other thing I think when you're in science and have spent a lot of time in science is that everything you believe for a fact at some point, there have been other theories that have been proven wrong. So I remember being in medical school and my immunology professor went through this long immunology pathway. I mean, spent 80 minutes teaching it. At the end of it, he goes, I want you to know in 10 years, this will all probably be wrong. That's the way it's worked. As we get new information, we only know what we know right now. So to understand that there's so much more out there that we don't know, that our human minds can't comprehend, I believe not in this life, I think is the beginning of spirituality and being open to something, of the mysteries and learning to be okay with not knowing, you
Mm,
know, be okay
yeah.
with not knowing and observing.
I
Yeah.
just have to note that I'm sitting here just in awe that we're talking to you because this conversation has gone, completely different than their
Totally
questions,
different
which is what
direction.
which is what always happens, and we'll get to those soon because I'm very curious. But I'm also just in awe because one thing that I've been saying for probably the past 6 months is that one of the things that the conversations I want to be having on this podcast is talking about the intersection of spirituality and science.
Mm,
And finding the connection between the two because there
hmm.
is. And I feel like you are such a beautiful example of that. And it's just, again, so incredibly divine how we were led to each other to have this conversation today. So I just wanted to
Oh,
recognize that because I'm sure anyone who listens to the podcast is like, how did they end up finding this woman? And I'm like,
Yeah.
I
it was,
don't know.
that's so funny, and I love that because I do believe there's such an intersection. And even my husband actually came into his faith listening to a scientist talk about faith. It was a scientist who gave these talks about faith and just the specificity even of scripture and numbers and things like that. So for my husband, he is a scientist, he's a surgeon, he's very concrete. For him to say, okay, this makes sense to me, um, it's always encouraging when we meet other scientists who say, how are people like you? How do you believe in all of this? And there are things that happen in all of our lives that we can't explain,
Mm,
that we can't explain, we can't wrap our minds around. But for me, too, there's also a strong intersection between mental health and faith.
mm,
So that is an area that I'm pretty passionate about.
Well, and faith is another topic that I've been
Mm,
very attached to this past year, or honestly, like 3 years, with everything that's going on in the world. And as far as
mm,
my own mental health and pulling myself out of, the darkness that I found myself in just through existing,
yeah.
uh, I've needed to lean on faith and in my own definition and what that
Hmm.
means for myself and just having hope and having optimism towards life and believing that things are going to be okay just on like a
Mm,
cellular level. I'd be
yeah.
curious to have you speak on that intersection of mental health and faith and what that means for you.
Yeah. When, as I talked about, just how our brain is wired to produce mood elevating neurochemicals. And to me, that is intentional. Why is it that giving back produces a trifecta of mood elevating neurochemicals, dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin? It is our connection with other people. We know that from the Harvard Grant study, the longest study in well being is our meaningful relationships are what result in wellness and longevity. I don't think that was an accident. And when we look at the things in spirituality that we consider values, humanity, serving, being connected to something higher than ourselves. It all goes together why those things are physically and emotionally beneficial for us as well. So there's that piece of it. But I think for me, just in terms of reconciling what is happening right now in the world, is the belief that there's more to life than this. We say to our kids all the time, like, why were you born into a family like ours and not in Gaza right now? That was not by your choice. And honestly, it's not fair. It's not fair. And for me, in my faith belief, and I'm Christian in the sense that I follow the teachings of Jesus, we're promised more in this life where things will be made fair. That's the only way I can look at what's happening in this world and have hope, to be honest with you, because there's a lot of hopeless things that we're seeing. And the other thing in my faith belief is, having followed the teachings of Jesus, Jesus suffered unjustly, and did everything right, and life still was not fair to him. He was killed. So we're not promised a life that is free from suffering. He showed us how to live towards other people lovingly, compassionately, inclusively. And that is something that I value in terms of my faith practice. But to know that the message wasn't that there won't be suffering, but that God will be with you in it, has also been really encouraging. For those who have a faith that says everything is going to be fine, eventually, yes. Maybe in the next, after this life, yes. But that doesn't resonate with a lot of people where everything is not fine right now. But again, the fact that there's hope even in suffering, that there's promise after this life, that to me is what gives me true hope, to look at what's happening in the world and then seeing, how can I alleviate suffering as well? We're also called to do that in whatever way that we can. And maybe not physically by being with people who are suffering in Israel or Gaza, but maybe it's in our own communities and circles where we could begin to affect that change.
Yeah. And I think a big piece of this puzzle is just knowing that you're not alone. And whether that is
Yes.
that faith aspect of someone is there watching me, someone cares about me, or if it is in the sense of community, whether that is friends, family, or spiritual community. So first,
That's
I'd like
right.
to kind of touch on the importance of community, whether it is in kind of a spiritual aspect, and then we can kind of go into when that spiritual community kind of goes wrong.
Yeah, that's a good pivot.
Well, and I'd like to just preface that we found you through the documentary
Right.
Secrets of Hillsong. I would love for you to touch on also kind of how you fell into that place of giving commentary on that
Hmm.
situation, maybe giving a brief overview of what that documentary is about. Because
Yeah.
as we've started this conversation, I think I'm so interested to hear what you have to say, just because you are a woman of faith and a Christian woman speaking about this topic. So
Yeah.
I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, so let's start with your question and then we'll get into community and the importance of community as well. So I was not trying to be in that documentary. I actually referred them to someone else to
Oh,
speak on
wow.
spiritual trauma, because trauma is not my background. I'm an anxiety specialist, but I had treated people from Hillsong, and I also had been connected to Hillsong because I had had family members attend Hillsong in New York, with the pastor being Carl Lenz. I saw their journey. I had a few patients who left Hillsong after that. So one of the producers had called me, who I know, and said, "Do you know anybody who speaks about spiritual trauma?" And I was like, "Sure, here are the people you talk to." I'm like, "It's not me." Like, I stay in my lane all the time. I don't want to talk about things that I don't feel I have knowledge in, an expert at an expert level. So, but I am a spiritual person. So I said, but this is my thought on Hillsong, and I just kind of rambled off for a little while. So I got a call the next day saying, "Niro, actually, I was talking about some of the things that you said in our meeting, and the director wants to talk to you." And I was like, "Sure, I'll talk to the director." I still was not planning to be in this thing. And then at the end of our meeting, she said, "Well, I'd really like you to speak in the documentary." And I was like, "What?" I said, "Okay, let me get back to you," because my first thing was, I don't know what they're going to do with this documentary. I don't know if it was to take down spirituality in the church, and I was not about that. So I really prayed about it, and I asked different people, "Will you pray for discernment and for wisdom?" Because I think we can ask for wisdom. and discernment, and we will begin to have the knowing and signs and whatever. And sometimes you don't know, you just have to kind of take a step of faith and say, all right, then maybe something will be revealed after I take it. And if it's the wrong thing, I believe that that's going to be used for a purpose as well. If I was not supposed to be in it, if it was a big disaster, that's going to teach me something as well. You know, we're going to make mistakes, even spiritual people, right? Especially spiritual people, we're going to make mistakes. So I went to the documentary interview. It was like a few hours. It kind of feels like a deposition. They grill you. And then at the end of it, you're thinking you have to sign all these NDAs and releases, and they're going to use whatever they want, however they want. And at the end of it, I was like, oh my God, I don't even know how they're going to use it. They could twist what I say. And I just continued to pray that whatever I said would be authentic, that they would use it correctly. So I was actually really thrilled that they only used maybe like a minute of my commentary in the whole thing. And it was only in the first episode. And I stand by still what I said, that we need church, but we need it with accountability. And we need people to do life with and to do faith with. So, you know, back to your question, I do think community is so important because even the people with amazing faith, you will hear stories of every great spiritual teacher, Mother Teresa, who at one point said, is this real? We have moments where we're going to doubt, where we're going to question. And when you're in community with other people, what I've told patients in the past who are struggling in their faith, I said there are going to be times in your life where you have to borrow somebody else's faith to get through, where you need to trust that that person, you might not have the faith, but that person has the faith for you to pull you through this in those moments. And I've had to do that with people as well. I look at people who have great faith stories. I said, today I'm going to borrow that person's faith because I don't have it on my own. And that's a very normal human spiritual experience to have those doubts. So community is great for that. Community is great in terms of even the effects of mental health, because we know being in connection to people elevates our mental health and our mood. We know that singing in groups, which happens in church, is one of the things you do where you physically cannot feel anxiety when you're singing. And where is a place where people sing in places of worship? So, and also in terms of serving opportunities and taking care of the community, I do believe that's how we were called to live. And communities help us in that respect. So they're a vital part of a spiritual experience, and especially because having doubts are very common to being spiritual. We're not going to be 100% all the time. And when we go through things, it's normal to doubt. Are we really alone? Is there someone looking out for us? And being in the presence of people who have stories can help encourage you in that. So your other question was about spiritual abuse.
Yeah. So again, touching on what you just said, when we saw you in the documentary, I was like, that woman is explaining everything in a very unbiased way, which I really appreciated.
Thank goodness.
Because you can't just be like, oh, it's all good. Obviously, any position, I feel like we've been seeing a lot of examples of that the last couple years, especially any places of power, there is room for people to be taking advantage of others. So I'd like you to talk about, yes, the spiritual abuse side of things, and maybe using discernment when you are in a spiritual group or community and things are starting to feel maybe a little off.
Yeah. So spiritual abuse in general, and the places we talk about it most are in institutions where there is power that is misused, and it's misused to control, it's misused to benefit oneself. It's also misused to shame people. So I think that that's a pretty good framework, and what we saw happen in Hillsong. And I will say this, there were so many good things that came out of Hillsong that it's a shame that there was such an abuse of power, not just in New York, but also in the global Hillsong in Australia. And I think the documentary is worth watching for sure. I knew many people who related to it, even coming from smaller spiritual communities who'd seen that. And I think that can help give you a lens to see what it could look like. But I do think it's important when you're going into a spiritual community that you use your own intuition and spiritual sense as a barometer. How do I feel in this place? Do I feel loved? Do I feel accepted? Do I feel connected? Is there anything that feels off that other people around me may be minimizing? because I think that happens too. We have a sense there's a red flag that goes off within us, but everybody else seems to normalize it because maybe they're used to it. And that also prevents us from actually being in tune with our discernment. I think it's important to talk to people in a community saying, what do you like about this place? And what are the challenges? What do you not like about this place? I also think a big thing is, where is the accountability? That question is really important because in that church structure, in that documentary, there was a lot of power with no accountability. There was people at the top, or person at the top, that was making a lot of decisions without having a group of people evaluating, um, is this okay? Is this right? Is it healthy spiritually? How do we go back to our set of values? Our set of values should be outlined in spiritual community so that they're very clear. And the hierarchy of power should also be made available so that we can see who is in charge here and do we align with the values. So I think when you go into community, you have to really talk to people. You have to do a little bit of digging to see, what do these people really believe? Um, who is welcome here? And sometimes we say that people are welcome in certain communities, but the actions might look a little bit different. It's important. I mean, if that is that community's belief, it's important that you're aware of it. You may not agree with it, but it's important that you're aware of it and then make your decision after that. Does
Why do
that
you
make
feel
sense?
like why do you feel like spiritual spaces are kind of more at risk to kind of have this kind of
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it because it can come out in a bunch of different ways, whether it's
Hmm.
someone that is kind of power hungry or wants to
Yeah.
manipulate. Why do you think, these communities are at such a risk for that?
Taking
So,
advantage.
Being taken
yeah,
advantage of.
I'll give you the very human side of it, and then I'll give you the spiritual side of it.
Okay.
Okay. So the human side of it is, I think people seek spirituality when they're vulnerable. I mean, there's some of us who've grown up with it our whole lives, and it's a way of life. But it also can be a place where you go when you're vulnerable, when you cannot find answers within yourself. And we saw this during COVID. Every therapist I talked to said people are talking about God and faith during COVID because we no longer had control, right? So that's oftentimes when we're looking to things beyond ourselves. We go through this existential crisis or whatever, anxiety, and then we become more open spiritually. So I think because people are vulnerable, they're more in a place to be taken advantage of, can be attracted to something that looks good and feels good, but there may be more to it. And then when you're vulnerable, some of your defenses are let
Mm.
down, which is good in terms of spirituality because you need some of that to step into spirituality and faith. But at the same time, it is a balance. And you need to go into it, yes, with your heart, but also a little bit with your head,
Mm.
and looking at things. Does this look like a spiritual community? Does this look like a healthy community to me? What in here does not feel or look healthy? And especially, like I said, if everyone around you is normalizing it, there's a tendency to suppress that feeling of, okay, then it must be okay. It's normal. Normal is not always equated to healthy. We conflate the two. I wrote a whole chapter about that in my book, right? So that, I think, on the human level is why. But I think on the spiritual level, I mean, I very much believe in light and dark when it comes to spirit. And I think because this is how we were created to live. I mean, we know that there's evil in the world. Look at what's happening in the world. There is clear evil, in my opinion. So I think spiritual spaces are most at risk because that's where we live a little bit transcendent. And I do think that there is darkness, that if there's any place to disrupt, it's there. What happens when something like this happens in a church? People stop believing in God. People walk away from spirituality, you know. To me, that's kind of the most dangerous piece of it. So I have seen it in spiritual spaces more, and I think there's a spiritual argument for that as well.
Yeah. And I love that you mentioned that. And that's why we wanted to talk to you, because I feel like most people who are having these conversations are people that are against religion, against spirituality,
Mm,
and see it all as bad. And they say, hey, look at what happened. We need to make sure this doesn't happen. Instead of saying, hey, let's make sure this doesn't happen, but it doesn't have to, we don't have to say all spirituality is bad,
that's
you know?
right. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, and I think those people may have been against spirituality to begin with. And also, for whatever reason, and people have very valid reasons, they've been very hurt by people who are quote unquote spiritual or religious. And so I think they have reason to feel that way. But I look at something like that and say, what a shame, because there's so many good things that came out of it. How can we do this better?
Mm.
Because in its beautiful form, it is community, it is loving each other, it's serving each other, it's taking care of each other, the way I feel like we were really created to live.
Yeah. What do you have to say to those people who have been hurt by, or just what your opinion is, people who have been
Mm,
hurt by the church or, organized religion, or I feel
mhm.
like it's a sensitive subject and I'm trying to be as, PC as I should be as far as like our audience members. I know we have a lot of people who define themselves as spiritual, but maybe don't connect with any one specific religion
Yeah.
or source. Do you have, and I think that's great, but maybe I think there are also listeners who may be listening to this podcast because they're kind of dipping their toes back into a sense of spirituality within themselves.
Mhm.
And that's one conversation. Again, I just love that we're talking right now because I think
Mhm.
there is so many beautiful aspects to all religions, but as far as from your point of view, Christianity, and there are a
Mhm.
lot of beautiful, beautiful things rooted in that religion. What do you have to say to those people who maybe feel like they've been hurt from that community?
Yeah. I mean, when I've worked with clients, I'll tell you, especially who've come out of the church, the Christian church, the first thing they'll say, I'm sorry, because you didn't deserve for that to happen. And I'm sorry that church did not look like Jesus. That's usually what I say to them. Because if it did, if it looked like and acted like Jesus, we would not be here having this conversation right now. And I think in terms of being a Christian, that's a big alignment that has to happen that we have to be aware of. Does it look like who Christ was and said he was? And maybe it's the people. I mean, the church is still full of broken people that do broken things. What I would love to see, because that's going to happen in any community, that's going to happen. But is there accountability? Do people apologize? Do they take ownership of their mistakes? I think that's really important for leaders in spiritual communities to be aware of. And I think there's, when I'm working with corporate clients, we talk about imposter syndrome. I think that goes on in church leadership as well. People are given power oftentimes early in spiritual spaces, and by virtue of, okay, I'm the speaker here or whatever it might be, or administrator, whatever, and they may not be ready for that power. And I think there is some imposter syndrome going on, that I have to look and act like I know what I'm doing and that I'm not going to make a mistake. But that's the opposite of genuine, transparent leadership, right? We have to own our mistakes, and then follow up with some accountability to that person who's hurt. So I would say I'm sorry, and I would say sometimes we have to separate, unfortunately, God from the institution, from that higher power from the institution, because in its purest form, God is love. It's God is acceptance. um, God cares for you like a perfect parent that maybe you didn't have in your life. And if that was not what you experienced in your religious community, I'm sorry, but it didn't reflect then who God is. So that's usually how the conversation goes when I meet with someone like that. And then we talk about, what does healing look like now?
Can you touch on that? What healing
Hmm.
looks like, maybe on a more broad point of view?
Yeah. If it is something that where someone has been hurt in an organization, we work on just connecting that person outside of organized religion with their faith individually, or with God individually, or with spirituality individually. What does that mean? Does it mean making moments of silence and meditation? Does it mean reading scripture or listening to songs that are uplifting and spiritual? Does it mean prayer and talking or journaling? But we find the practice that helps them to feel connected and open spiritually. And then, once we begin to foster more of a connection there, we can talk about pursuing communities that may feel safer, but also going in, having done the research, and doing the research and talking to people, like I said before, to get a pulse of the community. I always think it's really important too, when we go to spiritual spaces, we're going, yes, to receive, but also to serve, because we experience it differently if we're looking at, here's a community where I have something to offer and give and contribute. Because that's, I think, what maintains the vitality of the community, if we're not going just to take but to give, right?
Mm.
Um, So that's an important part in terms of being a member of a spiritual community. But we start then on the individual, personal, intimate level spiritually, and then move out into organized if that is the right thing for that person.
There's I was having this visual as we've been talking probably for the past 15 minutes, and just kind of power structures and what you're saying right now as far as like, making sure it's symbiotic and people are both giving and receiving from the space. There is a group that I have been a part of, and the woman who created the community is so beautiful, so lovely, so self-aware. And it got to a point where she's like, I feel like I have too much power and I need to like
Mm,
redistribute the power back to our community. And she was using the imagery of a pyramid or a triangle where there's that small little piece at the top and then it just kind of flows out to the bottom. And she's like,
mhm.
I need things to feel like a circle. I need to feel like
Oh, I
I am
love that.
giving just as much back to you guys, or like we're all holding hands, and feeling powerful together rather than you're feeding up to me this whole time. She's like, that feels
Mhm,
really icky. And she was like, energetically, I think that's happening kind of around the globe right now as far as redefining what these places of community look like, or places that are organized, because I don't want to, again, demonize like organized religion
mhm,
or any kind of organization. We just talked to a woman last week about corporations and how beautiful those can actually be, and how,
mhm,
I'd love to get your perspective on like manifesting and creating things for yourself in your life. But she's like,
mhm,
when you are in a group of people, a large group of people, you can get so much done so quickly when the intention is positive, when you're trying to give back, when you're trying to create something new. And I
mhm,
think same goes for what we're talking about here. Like when it feels good and it feels right, and you guys all have the same intention, and you're coming at it from a equal level, with everyone holding each other accountable and making sure you're taking care of one another back and forth, it can be a really beautiful thing.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful, and I love that circular power structure, and I do think it's dangerous when it's like a pyramid, right?
Hmm.
Because there's too much invested at the top. And I do think it's also important for spiritual leaders to have advisors who they trust, who have experiences that they don't. I mean, I've often advised many spiritual leaders just on the psychological, spiritual aspect of things, help making sure that they're looking at things from a holistic perspective and a healthy perspective. So I do think when you've been entrusted with that power, you have to steward it well. And part of that means having people come alongside you if you don't have that built into your power system, who can serve as advisors for you. And you have to make sure they're going to tell you the truth. A lot of people surround themselves with people who just give them positive feedback, and that's doing a disservice to the power that you have, and the people who you're leading. So, but I do think, when you were talking, churches do amazing work in this world. The work they do in terms of raising money for communities and for organizations abroad are amazing. For different charitable organizations are amazing. And oftentimes you find that when the power goes wrong in a church, it's a few people. It's a few people, but the heart of the people in that community is so good and so pure. So that's also what's very sad about what happened, because there were people who were at that church who had such amazing hearts, who served, who sacrificed, but what we're seeing is the actions of a few that affect many. So that's also something that I think is important to keep in mind. But you're right, even in corporations, what we can do together, is far more powerful than what you can do as an individual. So that it's another reason why we need to be in community. But what I've also found is, even just spiritually being in community, that when you have close relationships to people, often your spiritual wisdom is completed in other people. There's a sense of unity where I may have, I'll describe it like this. I may have a piece of a puzzle that will help to explain my experiences in my life, but I also often get another piece explained to me through someone else who I'm spiritually connected to. They will have something that they've heard said shown to them that's actually for me, much like I did for my friend with Time Magazine. As soon as I heard
Hmm.
it, I started praying for her. That has happened so often to me with people who I'm spiritually connected with and in community. And some of these people I'm not in any organized religion with. we just have spiritual conversations all the time. We pray for each other, we text each other, we check in with each other. That's a spiritual community in and of itself, as long as there's consistency, right? So I feel like we were meant to be connected to each other, to help each other navigate this life. And spiritually, that's how it can happen as well.
Yeah, I feel like there have been so many moments where I've heard a piece of advice or wisdom, and
Hmm.
I've heard it and I'm like, I understand it, but then someone will say it in a slightly tweaked way and it just hits. And I'm like, yes, now I
Yes,
understand. So I agree, having those people surrounding you, and it just takes that one person to say it a little bit different in the way that they
that's right.
understand it. And you're like, oh my gosh, I get it now.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well,
even just if you look at my own house, like God has certainly spoken things to my child that were
mm-hmm.
for me to increase my understanding and wisdom. And we, there's no greater connection right there than between me and my kids, and my
Or
husband.
even, yeah, I mean, even the conversation we're having now, I think about our audience, and I think
Mm,
about the collective and where we're at when it comes to the collective relationship with spirituality.
mm,
And I feel like, at least within our generation, with what I've witnessed, there's been a lot of
hmm.
like canceling spirituality, canceling that
Yes.
part of yourself,
Hmm.
disconnecting from that part of yourself. And you can only do that for so long until you need to feel human again. And that's a part of
Yes.
feeling human, is feeling that connection to whatever that means for you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think there's many different maps to the same place. Like, you can choose your journey and where you want to go, but I want to, make sure our space is open for whatever decision people want to make as far as how they want to get there,
Hmm.
and not
Hmm.
telling anyone one way is right. This is the way you have to do it. But I do think having a connection to those deeper parts of yourself, or a source energy, or God, or and whatever you want to describe it as, I just think it's really important to kind of find that part of yourself if you feel called to, because eventually I think we all kind of feel called to find that part again, because
Hmm.
again, collectively, there's been like a lot of pain, a lot of hurt, a lot of history, or maybe just narratives that other people have shared that get people to disconnect from those parts of themselves. But anyway, just as we were speaking about, like, God source energy speaks through other people, I think having
Mm.
you on this podcast right now and speaking to our community is really powerful.
Oh, thank you. No, I'm so happy that you're having this conversation, because I do think what prevents people from really engaging with their spirituality is fear.
Mm.
It's fear on many levels. It's fear, and even some skepticism because of what they've seen. They've seen people get hurt. They've seen people who have been very hypocritical in terms of speaking one thing and living another. And that's not what this is about. It's not what this is about. It's so much bigger than that. And I think to your point, this idea that we're not alone. We don't have to navigate this life alone. That there is wisdom, that there is hope, that there is strength to get through the things. And some of that strength it's hard to explain until you've experienced it. But I've seen people go through it. I've seen people, and we all know stories of people who we've heard who've forgiven the most unbelievable situations. Were they able to do that? That is spiritual. That's what you're seeing. That's what it looks like in its purest form. So I'm so happy that you're facilitating these conversations, because we're all going to need it at some point. None of us have the answers as to what goes on after this, but we're all
Mhm,
going to get there at some point.
mhm.
So it's
Yeah.
good that we start exploring it now.
Do you think everyone is meant to be spiritual in some way?
Hmm. I do believe that we were all created with the capacity to be spiritual. It's just a matter of how open we are to it. And no, we don't all start with a level playing field, right? You could be born into a home where you've been abused spiritually, right? Where it's caused a lot of shame in your life and guilt, and that's not what it was meant for. That's not what it was meant for. I came from a very healthy spiritual home. So for some, the path to discover it is a lot easier than others. But I think what I'd say is tap into the need for it. How could it benefit you in your life and what you're going through and what you want to go through in your life later on? I start
Yeah.
asking those questions.
When it goes back to, I just am picture again that intersection of spirituality and science, like the two go together so well when you really start.
Mm,
And if you're skeptical, really start breaking down science and energy and physics and watch it lead you right back to spirituality and the unknown. And,
Hmm.
because there's so much that we still don't know. Like you said, things are going to be changing so much as we go forward with these discoveries. And I feel like we've kind of stepped into this place collectively again where it's like, oh, we're so smart or we know so much that we don't need that
Right.
aspect anymore.
I know. I
And it's,
know. I
yeah. And it's so
know.
funny because you look back at our
Yep.
history, just being human, and all over the entire globe, people have practiced some sort of spirituality.
Hmm.
So I think it only makes sense that we, like you said, have the capacity to embrace those parts of ourselves.
I
Mm.
think one of the biggest problems with both science and spirituality is this aspect of hold on, I lost my thought. Let me see if I can bring it back. Okay, here it is. Both in science and spirituality, you have like this limited idea. Like once you get somewhere, you're like, whether it's your spiritual idea or your scientific idea, you mentioned it earlier, people have a hard time being open to new concepts. They're like, all right, I
Yes.
figured it out. This is where I am.
Hmm.
I don't need to explore anymore. And I think when we can
Yep.
keep that open mindedness in both science and spirituality, you can realize, hey, we don't always have it figured out. There's always more that we can learn.
Mm.
Absolutely. And I mean, true scientists will tell you that,
Yeah.
right? Who really have done the work and know, oh, yeah, this is what we thought based on what we know, but now we know differently. I mean, look at how COVID evolved, right?
Yeah.
That's
Mhm.
that's a pure example of that. But I think, yeah, the openness to learning more, yeah, is the beginning of spirituality. And I think we all have the capacity for it. We certainly all have the need for it
Yeah.
if we're actually really looking introspectively.
Yeah.
Well, this has been such a beautiful conversation. Thank you
Oh,
for being open to, yeah, just like letting the conversation flow exactly where it needed to. Like you were saying, I feel like God was speaking straight through you to our audience. And,
oh, thank
you
you.
know, thank you to anyone who's made it to the end of the episode. And I hope this means something to you and maybe shifts your perspective a little bit.
I hope so. Thank you so much for getting in touch and allowing me to be a part of this beautiful conversation. I look forward to hearing how it impacts people because I always know, before I have any conversation, whether it's in secular media or anything, I always pray that God does speak through me exactly what someone needs to hear in that moment. So I'm
Yeah.
trusting that will happen with this.
Yeah, we always feel that way as well, especially in a conversation that doesn't go the way we expected. We're like,
Mhm.
this someone was meant to hear this for
That's
sure.
right. That's
Well,
right.
for anyone listening that wants to maybe work with you, follow your journey, how can they do so?
They can contact me or see what I'm up to on my website, NiroFeliciano.com. And I do a lot on Instagram too. So I'm there as well, at Niro Feliciano, but happy to connect.